Hi, 2021 has been released, and these are the areas we've made modifications and improvements to. This video will review them all, and then I'll show you a few of them in the demonstration section. The IDE has an updated Eclipse base, and we've added support for remote projects. A remote project is where you have source code in your development environment, but you need to compile and execute in another environment or on a different server. One reason to compile and run programs remotely is when you want to compile directly to your test server instead of compiling on your development laptop and then manually moving the classes to the test server. I'll be demonstrating this later. Another case would be if you use native calls or a precompiler, and then you need to compile somewhere other than your development environment. Now, a side effect of this change is a slight redesign of the Compile Runtime Options screen. Notice in the picture that the mode and current mode are on the tab control instead of on the main screen as it was in the earlier IDEs. Now this is so you can choose one mode to compile and a different one to run, and you have control over the settings of each separately. There have been some big changes in the web client, one of our most popular products. It's been separated from the EIS suite of products into its own line. We've updated the core technology that Web Client is built on, and it's given the product some great new benefits. But now the Web Client will run with Java 11 as well as Java 8. It includes a new status bar for mobile devices, and support for those new high pixels per inch displays, and W3C certified accessibility support is added. The Web Client Administration Dashboard now runs on a separate port and as a separate service from the Web Client applications. This gives you better security, but it also lets you handle cloud implementations because you can access several Web Client installations on one admin dashboard. The dashboard looks quite a bit different and it's better organized. The messages generated from Web Client are in English by default, but now it's easy to change that language to whatever you want. By default, the Web Client services run in Jetty Web Server, but now you have the ability to run it in any JEE compliant environment, such as Tomcat. Now very soon we'll post a video demonstrating the new web client, so I won't be showing it in this video. There's a lot of GUI enhancements in 2021 R1. The tab control has new properties that change the look of the tabs. For instance, in the screenshot, the active tab has a 2-pixel wide border, with an active tab border color of red on the bottom with green background and white foreground colors. The non-active tabs have a 1-pixel border and text in dark gray. Some of the properties that were supported only on accordion tab controls are now supported on all tab controls. This is a tab with tab flat style set. I've set the tab color for a magenta background and a white foreground. By the way, because the tab color wasn't already set in my program, I was able to change the tab color by adding the variable and value in my compiler properties file, not in the code itself. And here's the line that I used. The ability to change the color when a mouse rolls over a control and when the control has been disabled has been expanded to more controls. You can put a background image in a container control. Those are listed here. Gradient color, previously available on Windows, is now expanded to these controls as well. And a Control F opens a search box in many of our controls, and we've added Tree View to that. We'll look at all of these in the demonstration. When you program a multi-line entry field, you didn't used to have control over where the line was broken to wrap to the next line. Now you can control it. You can set it to wrap at the end of a word, or at the end of a character, which is useful if you have national characters. 2021 R1 has added support for embedding Java FX components in a Java Bean control. This increases the number of Java Beans that you can use in your GUI screens. When you install 2021 R1, you can see an example of a Java FX component in our setup. And here's an example of how you would code this type of Java Bean to display an HTML file in a Java FX HTML displayer component. You can now specify a default date to return when an illegal date is entered in a date entry control. Here's a code example of that. And the $Open Save box now uses the native dialog when it's run on Windows. Now this hasn't changed anywhere else, and that includes Linux, Mac, or whenever used in Web Client. But when you use it in Windows, here's an example of the previous $C OpenSave box, and here's what it looks like now. There's a few compiler changes to talk about. A lambda expression is a function without a name, an anonymous function. It's used in object-oriented programming languages like C# and Java, and now Iscobol. As of 2021 R1, you can sort items that are in dynamic tables, even in a nested occurs statement. An example would be the W company OCC here. Every version, we add compatibility with other Cobols. There are some syntax differences Variant has added support for in our compile switch for IBM Cobalt compatibility. The first change is specific to debugging. You add the with debugging mode in the source computer area and use for debugging in a declarative section. And this will execute a section of code every time the use for debugging case occurs. The sample code here will execute the display statement every time the myPower1 paragraph is called. And you can turn this code on and off with the use for debugging configuration variable. The recursive clause added to a program ID line will let you run several instances of the program at the same time, recursively. This syntax is really a comment because Iscobol always allows programs to be called recursively. But the values of the variables in working storage are global in all the programs. So we've added a new section, the local storage section, where variables are specific to each run unit. Db2 and Esql are very common in IBM Cobalt, and we've added a few upgrades to accommodate it. One is a SQL descriptor area of variables similar to SQL-CA, but specific to Db2, and called SQL-DA. Another is the addition of the date and timestamp parameters commonly used in embedded SQL when you access Db2 databases. And two new functions have been added to handle national variables. The code here shows how to use these intrinsic functions to move a regular picx data item to a national data item, and how to display a national data item in a display statement. These are the changes we've added to make it easier for our customers converting from Micro Focus and RM Cobol. The local storage section I just talked about has been added to method ID programs. You can now create a table of objects using the occurs in object reference variables. Instead of using string to concatenate variables, you can use the ampersand now. When you forget a period in your working storage section, now you'll only get an error, not a severe error. This means the compiler will let you know what it found, but it'll fix it for you when it generates the class. Address and address of are both acceptable in your set statements now. File connectors are used when you have files and other formats that you want to access with Iscobol. We've had file connectors for Vision, C-Tree, DBmaker, and Micro Focus. Now we've added RM Cobol to that list. And the CR compatibility switch resolves a lot of the small inconsistencies between RM Cobol and Iscobol, and we've added support for RM Cobol's control statement for pop-up windows. We've optimized the core of Iscobol's sort operations. So sorting indexed and sequential files is 50 to 80% times faster for both internal and external sorting. Setting Iscobol properties in the external environment instead of your configuration file used to be a problem because there are periods in the properties and periods aren't allowed in environment variables. In 2021 R1, you can replace the periods with underscores when you set them in the environment, and the runtime will convert them to periods as part of the except from environment statement. This apply code path variable is new. It applies the code prefix to absolute paths as well as the standard relative paths. The example here adds /PRG to the absolute path in the call. When an abnormal termination occurs, a dump file can be created to give you information about the state of the application at the time of the append. These three variables turn on dumping, specify that the dump should be written to a file, and give the location and name of that file. You can remove trailing spaces in the callable file handler now, extfh. And we've added microseconds to ESQL timestamps. A new routine, $C$N call run, looks for programs launched with call run that are still running, so you can wait for all threads to stop before exiting. Oracle's Tuxedo is a middleware application server that connects applications written in multiple languages or using different databases. Iscobol 2021 R1 is qualified for Tuxedo 12, and it can communicate with Tuxedo through either calls to Tuxedo's C routines or using object-oriented programming Java methods. Now, part of that qualification was adding a new configuration variable and 2 new C API functions to handle the stop run statement at the end of the Cobalt programs. The Iscobol application server has been improved by adding logon time and message sending. Now, the addition of logon time is returned with these 2 existing library routines. They were just extended. But it's also shown in the 3rd column of the administrative panel, shown here. And you can send a message using a program with this text, or you can send a message to some or all of the connections through the administrative panel. The debugger. The remote debugger could always connect and disconnect to a running process, but now you can send a stop run to the application before disconnecting. You can display any variable in hexadecimal using the debugger's command line or from the Graphical debugger's window now. You may remember when compiling for debug meant the debugger required the presence of a separate source code file. Now, last year we improved that by embedding the source code in the class when compiling for debug. But this change meant if you were debugging some sources compiled with an older compiler and some with a newer one, you couldn't tell where the source code you were debugging came from, embedded or separate from the class. And there are times when you might want to load the source code from a disk instead of using the source code that is embedded in the class. For instance, if you were debugging preprocessed code. Now you have control over which source code the debugger uses with the configuration variable debug embedded source. Now also you can tell where the debugger loaded the source code from by the color of an exclamation icon in the debugger window. For example, the first one, green, means you're debugging code embedded in the class. The second one, blue, means you're debugging code found in the current folder, and it has the same timestamp as the one in the class. There is also a red exclamation mark, which means you're debugging code found in the current folder, but it has a different timestamp than the one found in the class, suggesting you should recompile. The EIS, or Extend Internet System, uses Iscobol's internal class called HTTP Client to communicate with existing REST and SOAP web services HTTP servers. Now, this internal class has been expanded by adding the methods doPatch to update a resource and doDelete to delete a resource from a server. 2 of our utilities have been improved. Migrate is used to migrate an unlimited number of data files in a folder, and it can run for an extended period of time. So we've added a progress bar for you to look at while you wait. When converting a file, you've always had the ability to call a hook program to modify a record before it gets written. Well, now, in that hook program, you can mark it to be deleted so it isn't written to the new file. ISL is our Cobalt Launcher. It's an easy way to create a startup command for your application by choosing options on a graphical screen, and then either copying the command that is built from these choices or running the application from the ISL screen. And we found that our customers run a lot of their batch commands from the ISL. So as of 2021, when you run the application from the ISL screen, we've added a console output view, so you can see the output in the utility and you don't have to switch back and forth with the terminal window. Now, if you've looked at C-Tree before, you might be confused by the new version number, 3.0. The last version available was C-Tree RTG 11.9, but 11.9 was the minor version number, and it was built on C-Tree RTG 2.0. So this new 3.0 release is the first major release in a while. In this version, the replication agent is embedded instead of a separate tool. It makes it easier to configure and maintain when it's combined with the C-Tree server. The replication agent can also run synchronously or asynchronously. And new indexed files that are created with open output are now replicated. 3 of the main tools needed by C-Tree database administrators and users are available as a web application now. This means you can access the database wherever you have a browser, even on a smartphone. If you're a past C-Tree user and you upgrade to 3.0, be aware that the folders have changed a bit. For instance, the configuration files are separate in a config folder. The driver folder is now the drivers folder with an S, and the command line tools are in the tools directory, not in the tools/command line. Iscobol's installation setups have been updated and improved. The IDE installation is now called Iscobol Evolve, and the setup lets you install both the IDE and the SDK together. We've added new Iscobol Evolve graphical installers for Mac and Linux environments. The default installation folder in Windows is now C variant instead of C program files, and C variant x86 instead of C program files x86 for the 32-bit installations. The new .msi for Windows installs means that you'll uninstall in Windows using the control panel. So let me show you some of these things. I have a Linux machine up now, and this is my test server. And I have a folder called test/videos, and in here I have a subfolder called program and some various files and bitmaps and stuff that I need, and a properties file that sets the code prefix to PRG. So I'm going to start the IDE remote project server. ISC server-IDE, and I'll need my host name. And what I want to do is from my Windows laptop, I want to compile my programs into this PRG folder right here that I have shown, and then I want to run it from here. So let's go to the IDE, and I have IS samples, one of our sample programs up. The next step is to add the server to the workspace, and you'll see a new box down here in the bottom left called servers. I'll click on the plus sign, and I'm going to name it test server, and again it's 192, and the default port is 10999. Say OK, and here's my test server. The next step is to configure this test server with the compile and runtime switches that I want to give it. I'm going to click on the modify properties button here, login, and I'll click this and say OK, and I wanted to put the classes into the PRG folder. I'm going to click on the O and activate the OD, and it's going to PRG. And OK with that. So now that I have the server, I need to assign the server to all of the projects that I want to go to that server. Well, I have just the one, IS samples. I'm going to right click on it, come down here to Iscobol remote servers, and there's my server list. I only have one, and I'll choose it, test server. Once I've done that, I now have more run modes. So let's click on the run modes up here. And you see I can compile for debug, release, or debug and release on the test server. And I can run locally or on the server. Well, I want to compile and run on the test server. So I've clicked those two. You can see them both checked. So now when I build this project, you can see that the classes are being put into that PRG folder on my remote server. Notice down here, it's telling me what compiler mode and runtime mode I'm in. And then when we're done, we'll run samples. And here we're running the programs that we just put onto the server. So let's take a look at some of the new features in 2021 R1. I'm going to minimize this. The first one in the list of the new features is the tab flat style and colors. So here you see the tab change color and change the bar on the bottom. Remember I said that the gradient color could be put on some controls now as well as windows. Here it is in the scroll pane, a tab accordion, a frame, a tree view, a list box, and notice the blue here on the tab control, and there's also a gradient color on the toolbar up here. The background image on the controls, you can see our logo, the V here, on the scroll pane, the tab accordion right here, and it stays on each page, the frame, the tree view, and you notice that the background image stays in place when I scroll back and forth, and the list box. I also talked about changing the color of the control when the mouse rolls over it. So here's a rollover for the push button, a check box, a radio button. And if we disable the controls, you can see that their color is changed as well. So this is just an extension of something that we had that you can now do to some different controls. And search panel style. This is a tree view, and we've added the search panel to it, so I can either press Control F, and here's my place to search. I can search for instance, VA, and I'll close this, or I can do it programmatically this way. All right. And $n call run. So I'm going to call it here, and it says there's one instance of a call run, which is this program. But if I call a second program, move it over. So I have two instances of call run. And when I close this, it's back to one instance of call run. So the last one is the $8 send message, but you can't send messages from a server started with a -IDE because the clients are all in separate run environments. So I'm going to close this one. I'm going to run the samples program locally with the application server running as a service. I configured it by changing the isserver.vm options in the bin directory, and I created a shortcut on my screen with an ISTC extension. Let's click on the shortcut and run $8 send message now. Here's the message that I sent from the server to the client. So there's a first look at Iscobol's 2021 R1. Thank you.